It was a quiet Sunday evening in Portland, Oregon. The sky was soft with the colors of late summer, golden light fading into a calm blue. Inside her cozy house, Claire Thompson, 36, sat alone with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Her home was warm and beautifully designed, just like her life, neat, organized, and perfectly under control. But deep inside, there was an emptiness she didn't often speak of. She had spent years working hard, building a name as an interior designer and convincing herself that being alone was easier. Still, some nights, when everything grew still, she felt the silence pressing too close. That evening, she was unpacking a few boxes of home decor she had ordered for her upcoming project. The boxes were heavy, stacked by the garage door, waiting for someone stronger to move them inside. Claire sighed, wiped her hands on her jeans, and pushed at one box, but it didn't budge. Then, a knock on the door startled her. It wasn't the quick, sharp kind. It was a polite, careful sound, as if the person outside didn't want to disturb her when she opened the door. She saw Evan Miller, the 19-year-old son of her new neighbor. He stood with an easy smile, sunlight catching in his light brown hair, his hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets. "Hi," he said. "I'm Evan. My mom just moved in next door. I saw you struggling with those boxes. Do you need a hand?" His tone was kind, unassuming, and his eyes carried a genuine warmth that caught her off guard. Claire hesitated for a second. She wasn't used to accepting help, but something in his smile made it impossible to say no. "That would be nice, actually," she replied. Together, they carried the boxes into her living room. He worked quickly, talking, in short, friendly bursts about how they had just moved from Seattle, how he was studying photography, how Portland already felt like home. Claire found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. When they finished, she offered him a glass of lemonade, and they sat outside on the porch as the day slipped quietly into dusk. Evan looked around, admiring the calm street and the way her porch lights glowed softly against the twilight. "You have a really peaceful home," he said. "It feels like the kind of place that should be full of stories." Claire looked at him curiously. "Stories?" He nodded. "Yeah. Every home has them. Laughter, heartbreak, moments that shape it. You can almost feel them in the air." His words surprised her. She hadn't expected something so thoughtful from a 19-year-old. There was something about the way he spoke, not childish but not worn down by life yet. Fresh, honest, full of curiosity. She watched him talk and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a real conversation that didn't revolve around work or daily chores. When he stood to leave, he thanked her for the lemonade and said, "If you ever need help with anything else, just knock next door. I'm around most evenings." "Thank you, Evan," she said softly. "That's very kind of you." After he left, Claire lingered on the porch, her mind unsettled in a quiet, unfamiliar way. The air felt different now, lighter somehow. She noticed the faint sound of his mother calling him from next door, the warmth in his voice when he replied, and then silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Inside, she found herself glancing at the boxes they had carried together. It wasn't just that he had helped. It was how natural it had felt, how easy it had been to let someone into her space, even for a short while. She caught herself smiling and shook her head, almost embarrassed by her own thoughts. He was just a kind neighbor, nothing more. But deep down, something gentle and unexpected had stirred a reminder that her heart, though quiet for years, could still notice warmth when it appeared. Later that night, Claire stood by the window, looking out at the faint lights from next door. She could see Evan sitting outside on his porch, his camera resting in his hands, focused on the darkening horizon. There was something peaceful about him, something that felt unhurried, real. For a moment, she imagined what he might see through that camera lens. Maybe the glow of her window, the soft outline of her garden, or perhaps nothing at all, just the quiet beauty of a still night. She sighed and turned off the lights. Yet sleep didn't come easily. Her thoughts kept circling back to that knock on the door, to the way his voice had sounded when he said her home felt like it needed stories. He was right, she thought. Her home and maybe her life had become too quiet, too still in that simple, ordinary moment. Something inside her began to shift. She couldn't name it yet, but it felt like the faintest spark of life after a long pause. A reminder that being alive wasn't just about breathing or surviving, but about feeling something again. That night, Claire didn't know what would come next, or that this chance meeting would become the beginning of something that would change her view of herself. She only knew that when she heard that gentle knock. The silence she had lived with for years had cracked, just enough to let the light back in. And though she didn't realize it then, that evening, that single knock would mark the start of a story that would awaken the woman inside. Her who had been quietly waiting to be seen again. The days after that evening passed quietly, but something had changed. Claire found herself noticing small things she hadn't before. The sound of laughter from the neighbor's yard, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the warmth of sunlight on her hands as she worked. Life felt lighter, almost as if the air carried new meaning. And then, one afternoon, she saw Evan again. He was helping his mother unload groceries, his camera hanging from his neck, his hair catching the light like a summer memory. When he saw her standing by the fence, he waved. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled the space between them with an easy warmth. From that day on, he started stopping by often, sometimes to bring her a package left at their door by mistake, sometimes to ask questions about decorating his mother's new living room. But more often than not, it was just to talk. They would chat over tea or lemonade about music, books, and the little things that made life interesting. Claire learned that Evan loved photography because he saw beauty in ordinary moments. Sunlight on old wood, reflections in puddles, or the way people's faces changed when they talked about something they loved. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and it had been years since anyone had done that for her. She found herself opening up, telling him stories about her travels, her work, and the dreams she once had before life became so carefully planned. Evan never judged or interrupted. He had that rare calm that made her feel safe enough to be honest. One afternoon, he asked if he could take photos of her house for a college project. It's for a series on spaces that tell stories, he said. And your home feels alive, like it has something to say. She hesitated at first, unsure about letting him in again, but his sincerity made it impossible to refuse. "All right," she said with a small smile. "Just don't make me look too serious." The next morning, he arrived early, carrying his camera and a quiet excitement that made her laugh. As he moved through the rooms, adjusting curtains, chasing sunlight, she watched him work. There was something graceful in the way he focused. Patient, observant, as if he was trying to understand more than just what was visible. When he asked if he could take a few portraits of her, she froze for a second. "Me? I'm not really someone people photograph." He smiled. "That's exactly why I should. Real people make the best pictures." She stood by the window, unsure of where to look, and he said softly, "Just be yourself." The camera clicked, and she felt a strange warmth rise inside her. Not embarrassment, but a quiet realization. No one had looked at her this way in years, not as a client or a friend or someone who had everything figured out, but as a person who still mattered. When he showed her the photos later, she was speechless. The images weren't glamorous, but they were alive. Her eyes looked softer, her smile genuine, her posture relaxed. "You see this?" Evan said, pointing to one photo. "That's someone who's at peace, even if she doesn't realize it." That night, long after he left, Claire sat at her desk staring at those photos. She saw herself through his eyes, not as the woman who worked too much or lived too quietly, but as someone who still had light left inside. It startled her. How easily he had captured something she'd forgotten existed. She felt a strange pull in her heart. Not attraction exactly, but a deep connection. It wasn't romantic. It was something purer, something that made her feel seen. Days turned into weeks, and his visits became part of her routine. Sometimes, he would show her his photos from around the city, people laughing in cafes, old couples holding hands, raindrops on glass. Each image had a story, and when he spoke about them, his voice carried a kind of hope that reminded her of her younger self. One evening, they sat in her backyard watching the sunset, Evan told her how photography helped him slow down in a fast world, how it made him notice moments most people missed. Claire listened, feeling a quiet admiration for the way he looked at life, so unguarded, so open. "You know," he said suddenly, turning toward her, "you're one of the most real people I've met." She laughed softly. "Real? That's an interesting word." He smiled. "I mean it. You don't pretend to be perfect. You just are." The words lingered in her mind long after he left that night. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her like that, with honesty, without any hidden meaning. She realized how much she had missed connection, not romance, but genuine understanding. Evan was young, yes, but he carried an old soul, the kind that noticed things others overlooked. Their bond grew naturally, unspoken yet undeniable. When he smiled, she found herself smiling too. When he talked about his dreams, she felt inspired. It wasn't about age or attraction. It was about energy. The exchange between two people who reminded each other that life still held wonder. But somewhere deep inside, Claire also felt something else: fear. She knew this kind of connection was rare and delicate. She didn't want to ruin it by reading too much into it, by letting her heart wander into places it shouldn't. So, she kept her feelings quiet, choosing instead to cherish the simplicity of what they had. Two souls sharing stories, finding light in each other's company. One afternoon as he left, he turned back and said, "Claire, you've got this way of making people feel calm, like everything's going to be all right." She smiled, and when the door closed behind him, she stood there for a long moment, realizing that for the first time in years, she did feel all right. But as she watched him walk down the street, camera swinging by his side, she couldn't shake a quiet thought. Maybe he wasn't just helping her remember how to live. Maybe she was teaching him something too. That evening, as rain began to fall and the city lights flickered outside, Claire sat by her window with a gentle smile. Something beautiful was unfolding, slow, innocent, and pure. It wasn't love yet, but it was something that made her heart breathe again. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew they had found something rare, a connection that didn't need to be defined to be real. Autumn arrived quietly in Portland. The air grew crisp, leaves turned golden, and the days felt shorter, softer. For weeks, Claire and Evan had settled into an easy rhythm: morning hellos, short chats at the fence, and long evenings filled with quiet laughter. But now, things were about to change. One afternoon, while helping her hang fairy lights on her porch, Evan mentioned he'd be leaving soon to return to college in Seattle. The words hit Claire harder than she expected. She smiled and said she was happy for him, but deep inside, small ache formed, the kind that comes when you realize something special is slipping away. That evening, she couldn't focus on her work. Her house felt too still again, like it had before he arrived. She caught herself listening for his voice, for the light sound of his footsteps outside. It was strange how quickly he had become part of her days, how naturally his presence had filled the quiet spaces she'd once accepted as permanent. She told herself it was normal, that she'd just gotten used to his company. But her heart knew better. The next few days passed faster than she wanted. Evan came over a few times to help his mom pack for the move, and each time he stopped by Claire's porch. Their conversations carried a trace of something unspoken, warmth mixed with sadness. He would talk about his plans, his classes, and the photo exhibit he wanted to put together. She listened with genuine pride, though every word reminded her that soon he'd be gone. On his last evening before leaving, Evan showed up at her door with a cup of coffee and that familiar, easy smile. "For all your late-night work," he said. "A goodbye gift before I go." She smiled, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're not leaving forever, you know?" He nodded. "Yeah, but it's still hard to go when something feels unfinished." They sat outside on her porch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the autumn sky fade from orange to deep purple. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of everything they didn't need to say. The sound of crickets filled the air, and for a long moment neither moved. Evan broke the silence first. "You know, Claire, when I first met you, I thought you had everything figured out. Your home, your work, your calm. But now I think you're still figuring out life, just like the rest of us." She laughed quietly. "You're not wrong. I think that's what life is, a constant process of figuring things out." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You've changed how I see people. Before, I used to think life was all about chasing dreams. But you've shown me that sometimes just being still, just feeling, can teach more than moving fast ever could." His words touched her deeply. For a moment she couldn't speak. There was a sincerity in him that made her heart ache, not with romance, but with something even more fragile, the recognition of connection as the night grew colder. She finally said, "You've reminded me that life doesn't stop after a certain age. It just becomes quieter until someone walks in and stirs it again." Their eyes met for a long second. There was no need for more words. They both knew this was goodbye, at least for now. When he stood up, she followed him to the end of the porch. The wind rustled through the trees as he turned to face her. "Promise me something," he said softly. "Keep doing the things that make you feel alive. Don't go back to just existing." "I promise," she replied. He smiled, then reached out and took her hand gently. It wasn't romantic, it was a gesture full of gratitude, respect, and quiet affection. His hand was warm, steady, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. Then he let go, stepped down from the porch, and walked toward his car. Claire stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the fading light. The emptiness returned, but this time it was different. Not cold or lonely, but tender. He had left behind something intangible yet powerful. The reminder that her life wasn't done evolving. That her heart could still awaken to beauty, connection, and possibility. That night, the house felt unfamiliar. The quiet was heavier. The walls seemed to echo with memories of laughter and conversation. Claire wandered through the rooms he had once photographed, the window where sunlight had caught her face, the porch where they had talked for hours. Everything looked the same. Yet nothing felt the same. She sat down at her kitchen table and opened her sketchbook. The one she hadn't touched in years. Slowly she began to draw, first the outline of a house, then the soft shapes of trees, and finally a figure standing under the golden light of a porch. She didn't think about what it meant. She just let the feeling guide her. As the drawing came to life, she realized she wasn't sad because he was gone. She was grateful that he had come at all. People like Evan don't enter our lives by accident. They arrive to remind us of the parts of ourselves we've forgotten in the days that followed. Claire returned to her work with new energy. She started taking walks in the mornings, watching the city come alive. She found herself paying attention to little things again, colors, textures, the way light fell across her kitchen counter. Everything felt new, as if the world had been quietly waiting for her to notice it again. Sometimes she would catch herself wondering what Evan was doing, whether he was taking photos of the city, whether he still thought of that evening on her porch. But she didn't dwell on it. Their connection didn't need constant presence to matter. It had already done its work. It had reminded her of who she was beyond the roles she played as the weeks passed. The ache softened into peace. She started hosting small gatherings for friends, filling her home with laughter again. The silence that once felt heavy now carried warmth, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath. One evening, as she sat by the window, a thought crossed her mind. Maybe the most meaningful relationships aren't always the ones that last forever. Sometimes they're the ones that arrive unexpectedly, stay just long enough to change us, and then leave us better than before. Evan had been that for her, a brief, bright chapter that awakened something long asleep. And as the autumn wind swept through the trees outside, Claire smiled quietly to herself. The distance between then and now wasn't empty. It was full of everything she had learned, everything she had felt, and everything she had yet to become. Winter came softly to Portland, wrapping the city in gray skies and quiet rain. The holidays passed, neighbors hung lights, and families gathered. But for Claire, the season carried a different kind of warmth, a peace she hadn't known in years. Months had passed since Evan left for college, yet his presence lingered in the smallest corners of her life. Sometimes she'd catch herself smiling at random moments, like when sunlight touched the same window where he had once taken her photo. The world around her hadn't changed much, but she had before meeting him. Her days had blended together. Work, errands, the same quiet evenings. Now everything felt sharper, more alive. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since her 20s. At first it was just colors and shapes, but soon she found herself painting moments. A porch bathed in orange light, cup of coffee left half finished, a camera resting on a table. Each brushstroke carried emotion, memory, and gratitude. It wasn't about art. It was about rediscovering the joy of feeling. Her friends noticed the change. "You seem happier," one of them said over lunch. Claire laughed softly. "Maybe I finally stopped waiting for life to happen." She didn't explain further. How could she describe that the change began with a single knock on her door, with someone who reminded her that life could still surprise her even at 36? As weeks turned into months, Claire learned to enjoy her own company again. She filled her home with music, fresh flowers, and color. She volunteered at a local art class, helping teenagers learn design. Watching them dream, laugh, and express themselves reminded her of Evan, of his curiosity, honesty, and how his youthful spirit had reignited her own. She realized that inspiration didn't always come from love or romance. Sometimes it came from connection, from the right person showing up at the right moment. One afternoon in early spring, as she sat painting by the window, she noticed the mailman drop something in her box. It was a small envelope with handwriting she recognized instantly, neat, slightly slanted, full of energy. Her heart skipped as she opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. It was her standing by the same window, sunlight touching her face, eyes soft and thoughtful. On the back, Evan had written just one line, "To the woman who reminded me what beauty really means." Claire held the photo for a long time, her throat tightening with emotion. She remembered that day, how nervous she'd felt in front of his camera, how uncertain she'd been about what he saw in her. Now, looking at the image, she finally understood. He hadn't just captured her face. He had captured a moment of rediscovery, the exact second. She'd started to see herself differently. A tear slipped down her cheek, not out of sadness, but gratitude. It wasn't about him being gone. It was about what he'd left behind, courage, light, and a part of herself she thought had disappeared years ago. She placed the photo on her mantel beside a small vase of fresh tulips. Every time she walked past it, she smiled, not because she missed him, but because she was thankful he had existed. That evening, Claire took a walk through her neighborhood. The trees were blooming again. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. She passed by Evan's old house, where new tenants now lived. The sight didn't hurt. It simply reminded her that time moves on, and so do people. But memories, the meaningful ones, don't fade. They become quiet companions, shaping who we are. When she returned home, she brewed tea and stood by her window looking out at the city lights. Her reflection in the glass surprised her, not because she looked different, but because she looked alive. There was warmth in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. She thought about how life sometimes brings people together for reasons that don't always make sense right away. Some stay, some leave, but all leave a mark. Evan's letter had arrived at just the right moment, when she was ready to let go of the past and embrace the future. That night, Claire made a decision. She packed a small bag and booked a short trip to the Oregon coast. Somewhere she had always wanted to go, but never found the time for. The next morning, she drove along winding roads. The ocean slowly appearing in the distance, vast and endless, standing by the shore. With wind in her hair and waves crashing against the rocks, she felt free, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet sense of finally belonging to herself. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." She wasn't thanking him alone. She was thanking life for giving her another chance to feel deeply, to see beauty again, to wake up every morning with purpose. In the months that followed, Claire's life continued to grow in new directions. Her artwork caught the attention of a small local gallery. And soon, she was invited to display her collection, a series she titled Awakenings. At the opening night, people admired her paintings. unaware of the quiet story behind them. Each canvas held a piece of her journey, moments of rediscovery, emotion, and hope. As she stood among her paintings, she thought of Evan again. Maybe somewhere he was walking through his campus, camera in hand, chasing light as he always did. Maybe he would see her name in an art magazine one day. But even if he didn't, it didn't matter. Their paths had crossed exactly when they were meant to, and that was enough. Months later, as summer began again, Claire sat on her porch during golden hour, the same time of day when he had first knocked on her door. She smiled at the memory, at how something so simple had changed everything. The house that once felt too quiet now felt full of life. Laughter from visiting friends, the scent of fresh coffee, the sound of music floating through open windows. Claire wasn't waiting anymore. Not for love. Not for meaning. Not for something to begin. Life was already happening, and she was part of it. She was no longer the woman who simply watched seasons pass. She was the woman who painted them, lived them, felt them as the sun dipped below the horizon. Claire whispered softly to herself, "He didn't stay, but he woke me up." And that truth, simple yet powerful, filled her heart with peace. She looked at the photo one last time before turning off the lights. The woman in the picture, calm, thoughtful, glowing in the sunlight, was her, but also someone new, someone who had learned that sometimes a single person's kindness, a shared moment, or even a goodbye can be the start of becoming whole again. That night, as rain began to fall softly outside, Claire smiled in her sleep, because she finally understood love doesn't always arrive to last forever. Sometimes it just comes to remind you that your heart can still open, and that's enough.